I'm returning now to a series I started a while ago called Between Wars, Post-War. The idea of that was to look at some writers who were considered very influential and important in that time. Between wars meaning between the First and Second World Wars. Some people consider that the First and Second World Wars were really as part of the same war, which is probably a good argument for that. But anyway, so they wrote in that time between those two and then shortly after the Second World War. So some of the people we're talking about are Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, who are both French, Franz Kafka, who was Czech, wrote in German, Samuel Beckett, who was Irish but wrote a lot of his works in French. And then I'm even going to eventually get on to somebody like Günter Grass, who was German, who wrote a bit later than that, but I think can in some ways be included amongst that same movement. And then even before then, going back even before the First World War, if you look at Joseph Conrad, who was Polish but wrote all his works in English, there's a lot in his works that seem to anticipate some of that mood of that between wars time. So as I said, when they wrote that, and shortly after, a couple of decades after it, people thought they're really saying something really important that maybe we think as well, and we're influenced by them, and we should be taking note of what they're saying. You don't hear so much about them nowadays, although I think they're still considered important. Another one I forgot to mention was Louis Ferdinand Céline, who was another French writer in that same period. You don't hear anything about him now, really, and he was never as popular outside France as those other writers are. But he's still, I really liked him a lot when I was in my young adulthood days. So anyway, that's the concept of between wars, post-war. So in these series of videos I've been doing, episodes 25 to 47 were all taken up with a reading of the book The Fall, which is one of Albert Camus' books. And then during that time we spent a couple of episodes, in particular episode 30, 38 and 42. We stopped the reading and just made some commentaries like I'm doing now. So that was all Camus, and I'm going on with Camus now. Eventually, then later we'll come to some of those other writers. It's going to take a long while to look at all of those things, so we'll probably have a few episodes like this and then stop and do something else for a while and then come back to this again and eventually work our way through them all. So Albert, or probably each one should say Albert Camus, I suppose, he died quite young in a car accident. When you look at photographs of him, he looks kind of like a cross between Humphrey Bogart and James Dean. So he's kind of a romantic figure, I guess, in his day. He wrote a number of plays and novels, most of them fairly short, quite dense. And as I said, had a lot of influence. So today we're just going to look at this one called, in French it's called L'Étranger, but the English translation of it was called The Outsider. The French word itself really means foreigner or stranger, so it's interesting they called it outsider, but I guess there's reasons for that. So we'll just look at that today anyway. So it was one of his most, again, famous and influential books, I suppose, one of his earlier books. So it concerns this character called Meursault, I hope that's the right way to pronounce it, who is an ethnic French man living in Algiers. There's a time when Algeria was, I suppose you'd say, a colony of France. I'm not sure if colony is right, but the French controlled it anyway before the war that gained independence for Algeria. So back in the days when the French were governing Algeria. So he lived in Algiers. At the beginning of the novel, he hears that his mother has died and he's been invited to come and view her body and then attend the funeral. He goes to where her body is. He shows almost no signs of any emotion or engagement with the thought of his dead mother. And And all this is noted by people around him and used against him later when it comes to a court case that he's involved with. The day after his mother's funeral, he goes to the beach, gets into a relationship with a new girlfriend, goes to see a comedy film at the Pictures, and again all those things are noted by other people and brought forward later on. His girlfriend, after a while, suggests that maybe they should get married and asks him if he would like to marry her, and he says, "Oh, yes, if you want to, if that's what you want to do." And then she says, "Yes, but do you want to? Do you love me?" And he says, "Oh, what does that mean? I don't know. If you want to do it, we'll do it." And then he makes another friend who is obviously a small-time criminal. He knows his friend beats his wife violently. He knows his friend is engaged in criminal activities, and he sees some of those taking place. But he still encourages the friendship. He visits his friend's house at the beach, and they go for a walk along the beach and encounter an Arab man that the friend has been involved with some criminal activity with. And they get into an argument and almost a fight and have to retreat from that to save themselves. But after that, Meursault, when his friend is asleep, picks up his friend's gun, puts it in his pocket, and then walks back along the beach to where he knows the Arab lives, and meets the Arab, they start an altercation again, which turns potentially violent, and so Meursault pulls out the gun to defend himself and shoots the Arab. But then while the Arab is lying helpless on the ground injured, Meursault shoots him 4 more times. So of course then he's arrested and charged with murder and prosecuted. And at the trial, the prosecutor suggests that he's kind of a psychopathic, cold-blooded killer, and people come forward with the evidence that he showed no emotion at all when his mother died, and as soon as his mother's funeral was over, he went out, got a new girlfriend, and went to the Pictures and the beach. That he, knowing that he was likely to encounter this criminal on the beach, deliberately walked there with a gun in his pocket, and then when he'd wounded the Arab, he fired 4 more shots into him. So it would be hard to escape the conclusion that he was a cold-blooded psychopathic killer, and that's, most people would probably think that, but obviously, well, Camus seems to suggest that's not what he thinks, but then what does he think? So anyway, Meursault comes to trial. A few Christians cross his path. The magistrate who examines him is intrigued by this character, Meursault, and actually tries to convert him to Christianity, which Meursault rejects. But the magistrate's not antagonistic in a kind of almost friendly way. He calls him Mr. Antichrist whenever he meets him. And then when Meursault's been found guilty and imprisoned, a chaplain in the prison again tries to bring him around to an understanding and relationship with God, and Meursault quite angrily, violently even rejects the chaplain. But then he talks about somehow whether one can actually see a vision of God or see his face somehow. And in another one of Camus' books written about the same time as this, called The Myth of Sisyphus, which we'll look at later, there are passages in there where he investigates the idea of actually seeing an image or a face of God. So that idea seems to have been in his mind at that time. But anyway, Meursault rejects the attempts of the chaplain and the magistrate to bring God into his life. But now he's faced with being executed because he's guilty of murder. And a lot of the novel is concerned with his reaction to that. And his desire to grasp and hold on to life. Life is so precious, and now it seems to be so short. And he just wants to experience it, even just to experience the wall opposite him. To just be able to see that, just any minimal experience is so valuable because it is, I'm alive and I'm experiencing something. And at the same time he knows he's going to be killed very soon, put to death. And that just causes so much anguish in him. And that's quite a few of Camus' books deal with a similar theme to that. I mean, most of Camus' books are very solemn and serious on these heavy themes. The Fall that we read in the earlier episodes, which is one of Camus' much later books, funnily enough, or paradoxically, or funnily I suppose I was right the first time, are more comical in a way. But his earlier books were very serious and very solemn. So there's this idea of death, life being cut short. In The Myth of Sisyphus, he talks about the main theme of the book is suicide, really, dying by suicide. Another one of his books, The Rebel, which is not a novel but kind of a philosophical treatise on whether one is entitled to carry out violent revolutions and wars to achieve an objective, whether the end justifies the means. So it's kind of talking about death by murder, by mass murder, as opposed to death by suicide in The Myth of Sisyphus. And The Outsider could be called a study of suicide by murder, in a way that Meursault almost deliberately set out to kill this man so that he would be found guilty of murder, so that he would be put to death. So was he actually suiciding himself by committing a murder? And he did that although life was so precious to him. And in The Myth of Sisyphus, which we'll look at later, he references a book by Dostoevsky called The Possessed, or The Devils. There's a character in that called Kirillov who has the same experience, who's going to suicide for a particular purpose, but mainly because he loves life so much, he wants to prove that he can consciously give it up. And Camus keeps talking about that novel a lot in a lot of his stories, and I think he's got the idea already here. Anyway, so what does all that mean, really? Where was I up to? So it's as though Camus I'm not sure if this is right, but Camus seems to be saying Meursault understands something that most people don't. Life is short and fleeting, and according to him, there's nothing after this life on earth. So we need to grasp and appreciate every bit of experience we can have here, and not to even hope for anything more or want anything more. It's sort of, we're fooling ourselves, we're cowardly, we're deceiving ourselves if we look for anything more. If one has courage, and if one is bold enough to see the truth and face it, then one would do what Meursault does and what Kirillov perhaps does, to give up or cause myself to lose my life, even though life is the only thing I've got. I think that's kind of what he's saying, and it's almost as though he's saying, well, the rest of us who don't hold that belief, we're not as good as Meursault because we fool ourselves, or we allow ourselves to be fooled by other things, by maybe religion, he would say, to persuade ourselves that there's something beyond this life. And we do that because we're cowards, we don't have the courage to face up to what Meursault has understood. I think that's perhaps what he's saying, I'm not sure really. I mean, just about all of his books are to do with dying quickly, as I said, being executed in this one. Suicide he talks about in The Myth of Sisyphus. Another one of his novels, The Plague, talks about everyone dying rapidly because of a plague that afflicts a town in Algiers. And maybe the plague itself is his representation of death, perhaps. And how do people cope with the knowledge that that's going to happen?